what do you think, as parents or guardians of kids, we could do to help encourage that and stop preventing kids through our education system and elsewhere from having that become a part of their working life into adolescence and then adulthood?
Yeah, but I'd say definitely the educational system we have now works against that. I mean, you're forced to sort of learn all this different subjects and math, you're not that interested in math and history. And I mean, I think, I'd be interested in kind of innovations in education, whether it's the Steiner School, Waldorf education, or, other ones. I mean, my daughter goes through standard high school here, and I think that in a way she's gonna have to spend a few years trying to get her creativity back after the amount of rote learning that you're forced to do. And I think a lot of that type of education is really not that appropriate anymore to the world that we're in or entering into. So yeah, the educational system probably needs to be rethought in terms of creativity and so on.
And if any of you don't have a specific answer for that, because you don't have kids or you haven't contemplated that, do you remember a point in your life when you realized, uh-oh, this isn't my flow and my creativity and who I am is not acceptable, and I need to shut it off? Do you remember that moment? Or moments?
I mean, I remember when I became aware of that moment. I think, and many people who have had experiences with psychedelics would say that when we first dropped acid or drank ayahuasca, particularly in our adolescence, when I was 19, I came to that awareness, not only about my relationship with, conditioning when it came to education, but just generally my relationship with culture. And the confines that's put around us from a creativity perspective. So that was, for me, probably when that insight first came to be. Dropping acid, for sure.
David?
I think for me, there wasn't one moment. I think my entire adolescence, really my whole life, let's be real, ever since I was probably first memories, I've cleared traumas of shutting down in preschool because the instructor didn't know what to do with my energy. So I think being a person of color, a child of immigrants, being a woman, being weird, I've often put it pretty bluntly, I feel like it was beat out of me. I feel like the flow state was beat out of me, so.
So my twin sister just had a baby, a Virgo, and I've been thinking about just ways in which I'd like to be a very parental figure in this baby's life with the permission of my twin sister. And I think what I'm just trying to always remember is that I would like to have my niece live in a world where it is still enchanted and where she can still actually apply enchanted and practical wisdom in her day-to-day experiences. Because I think what each and every one of us know here is that the way to be the most powerful in this world is to know that we are not of this world. And I would like my niece to have that same conviction so that she can align her thinking with that divine consciousness and then put her in the kind of effectuated change within the horizontal. That intersection is where I'd like to keep her. So, cool.
I don't really have much to add to that except what Daniel was saying about the educational system in ways that are super outdated for where we're at today. And I was really grateful for my parents, despite how I think confined I felt in the school system that I was in. They still gave me the freedom to create and express in whatever way I wanted. And I'm so grateful that I had siblings in order, in which to express that and explore that with. I was a kid who was, had imaginary friends and was talking to trees and weird shit like that. But, and then kids look at you like you're strange, and so you're just trying to hide that the whole time, and that really carried on into my late 20s, I would say. So having a support group, not a support group, a support system, a tribe, a family was really important to me, that the education doesn't stop when, the kids come home from school, but the parents play an active role in that as well, and the family plays an active role in that as well. So nurturing that kind of flow state of creativity. I got a couple. I call them guides now. That's what they've upgraded to.
I talked to some guides today, through someone. Guides talked to me. So I want to move into a little bit of the manifestation stuff, and this, going back a few years ago with, you know, the secret and the law of attraction and Abraham Hicks and all this stuff. People got really into like, oh, give me the house, give me the Porsche, I'm gonna visualize it, and that's, I guess, one way to do it. But what I'm interested in from you guys, because you're all successful in your own right, is how does visualization and acting as if something has, and my Course in Miracles guy right here, I'm sure is gonna have something great for this, but acting as if something already exists, doing vision boards, doing vision books, vision work. A lot of athletes will, you know, a basketball player will go through that winning play over and over and over again in their mind, where you're sort of doing a preemptive flow. Do any of you do any kind of work like that? How do you do it? What are the mechanics of it? Can you give us an example of how it's manifested? I put him on the spot already.
Well, when I'm talking to clients about intentions and manifestation visualization strategies, I always try to kind of have them discern the difference between appetite for something and soul desire for something. Because appetite is ultimately meaningless and is here to serve our ego citadel as it defines it, right? So, and the fact of the matter is, oftentimes we make our greatest mistakes because we have that appetite to react really quickly, right? I can do this, and we think it's a really good idea at the time, but it's not. So then the desire is a completely different orientation, and on the level of manifestation, I ask them to think about whether or not we're looking again at, I'm gonna use metaphysical law and the universe as like my errand boy, like you go and get this for me because I want it, right? Versus asking the universe what it wants and how I can serve it, which is, I think, again, what places us in really powerful spaces, particularly in the intersection of politics, asking the divine intelligence, how can I be an instrument of peace, rather than using metaphysical law to like, get what I want.
When you're speaking about desire, I think always checking in with, is this desire coming from a place of lack? Is this desire coming from a place that is going to serve the highest good, not just for me, but beyond that place? And when I'm thinking of visualization, because I do a lot of visualization work and journey work, it's more about what is the energy of that's coming through that I'm trying to manifest. And so a lot of the times when I'm working to manifest something or helping people manifest whatever their intentions are, an intention being an action rather than like a goal, just to cultivate that feeling. It's really the feeling, the energy that then, you know, puts that out into your vortex, so you're attracting like things. And at the end of the day, energy is either based in fear or in love. So are these desires, are these intentions based in fear, or are they based in love? Because then you're gonna attract the same thing. You know, because it's just as easy to manifest something negative as it is to manifest something positive, because that's where, you know, our mind will go, and it doesn't take very long to do that. So just to be mindful of your thoughts and what it is that you're visualizing, because the mind is a super powerful thing. But yeah.
So when it comes to just some of the language that I would use to describe my own, I guess, visualization process, I see it more as a pattern recognition element. In terms of, from a leadership perspective, when you're leading a team, an organization, you're trying to build and create something, then you need to come up with models that are effective, that are in line with where reality is at, to bring a team into that vision, to execute and create that in the world, essentially. And so when we look at, in particular, psychedelics as tools to help to facilitate that process, we look at something called divergent thinking. And so divergent thinking is basically the ability to take two concepts, two ideas that at the forefront seem unrelated, but then through the divergent thinking process, through the creativity process, there's a clear conceptual relationship that then can manifest an idea into reality. So like as an example of this, when I was in Budapest a few years ago, once again, on acid. I don't know how all these stories started on acid, but that was the case. I was with a couple friends, and we were going to these third wave coffee spots, which are basically these kind of, you know, hipster, bougie coffee spots that you find in Williamsburg that give you a nice latte with a swan on top. Right, so these are third wave coffee spots, and we were on psychedelics and talking about how, with all this emerging psychedelic research that's coming out, with all the cannabis legalization that's happening, how there's really a new conversation and movement evolving around these topics and these concepts. And so, kind of out of left field, a friend that I was with conceptualized it as this third wave of psychedelics. And we really had no idea what it meant at the time, which is often what the divergent thinking process represents. It's when an idea comes to fruition, you're not quite sure if it makes sense, you have to double check it. And I went back home, kind of checked it out and looked at it and said, oh, this does add up, it does make sense. And so it was taking those two separate ideas from a visionary perspective, third wave coffee and psychedelics, and then somehow coming up with this idea that ended up making sense in reality. And so that would be more my way of framing things.
Cool, thanks. I love what was said about adding the emotion, the positive emotion to an idea, to a desire, to a vision, and it reminded me of something, and I don't know who to credit it to, maybe someone knows, but I heard it said that worrying is praying for what you don't want. And it's so powerful. I know in my own life I've put so much energy into the aversion of what I perceive to be losses or uncomfortable situations and actually brought them about. It's like the visualization and the manifestation of the opposite of what you desire. It's a trick of the universe there. So yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you for the reminder. Let's see. So, where do I want to go with this? So many questions, so little time. I want to talk a bit about the neuroplasticity, and I will break that down to very simplistic terms about negative and positive thinking and the negativity bias that so many human beings have. We're sort of wired to be afraid of everything, and we're always looking to procure the needs of our instincts and the ego, and threatened by everything around us. And so, in my own experience, I've had to work really, really hard to change my perception of my reality from negative to positive, and I have been able to actually rewire my brain in many ways for a positivity bias, that I am able to actually see the glass half full automatically and not have to wrestle myself into that reality. So what are each of your experiences with dealing with the negative mind and actually permanently changing the way that you're wired so that you're not coming from that place of negativity automatically?
Yeah, I think there's a distinction between trying to look at reality in all of its multidimensional levels and being negative, So I spent many years working on a book, looking at what's happening ecologically, and it was actually very, very tough to do it. It was like labor that, nobody wants to do at this point. And it's, but I think that, creativity involves also having that courage to kind of look into darkness. Carl Jung said, you don't get enlightened by envisioning figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. So, but yeah, it's always good. I think you can only do that if you have a hopeful or optimistic or mystical worldview. If on some level you feel that there's some undergirding that even if things look very dark, there's probably so much that we don't know about what the spiritual forces are organizing.
Hi. So I want to answer this. In a couple parts. One tool that I have working with negative thoughts is a technique called flipping it around. So anytime a negative thought appears in my mind, I just rephrase it to its counterpart, to its opposite. So we often think in terms of what we don't want or what we're stressed about. So thinking, instead. So I don't want to be broke. I want abundance. The opposite. Just thinking the opposite. And even if you don't believe it, just reprogramming that and rewiring it in your mind does have an impact, and doing it with repetition does have an impact as well. But I do want to touch to the nuance of that exercise and just the kind of prescriptiveness of what I just said and the mechanical nature of that, juxtaposed with the reality of the darkness, so to speak, and recognizing that where is that negative thought coming from? What is it rooted in? And so because flipping it around is an energetic exercise. it's shifting energy, but that doesn't mean that you ignore what the negative thought was and where it came from. And that is something that we in fact need to sit in. That I think as a society we are conditioned to feel like we have to push away. It's actually very radical, intense, scary work to not only recognize your darkness, recognize it, invite it, and sit in the center of it. Allow it to grow as it needs to, not wallow, but to be in its entirety and then accept it and be in a place of neutrality and then watching it dissolve or move or whatever it needs to do.
I think a lot of the traumas that we experience, even from birth, affect the way in which we see the world. And so when you have these self-limiting beliefs that, that are informing these negative thought patterns, it causes, Seher was talking about going to the root, and the root of these things are based on those traumas. So there are certain triggers that trigger us, obviously, to go down that spiral. So exploring the trigger and then really healing the root of that trauma so that the trigger is no longer a trigger. And really sitting in the darkness is just really befriending the shadow. And I do believe in non-duality, where there's really no good or bad, it just is. And everything in that sense becomes an experience. So these experiences of the negative thought patterns are kind of, if you're creating that awareness around it, is where are these negative thought patterns coming from? What are they rooted in, and how do I heal that so that they no longer exist, or they no longer come back in the same form? So I think introspection and allowing yourself to, to create a practice of self-inquiry really helps you shift from negative-based thoughts into thoughts that are, again, born out of love instead of fear.
It's kind of like a contraction versus an expansion. And that's a little bit of how I think about it. So how are we cultivating practices that help us to expand? Because when we feel like we're contracting, when we feel small, when we feel like there's this kind of negative impression that we have of the outside world, that in a way takes away our agency and our autonomy to actually then go and create what it is that we want to create. So how can we cultivate practice, whether that's meditation, breath work, intentional psychedelic use, so that we feel at our core that we have, from a body, mind, spirit perspective, the agency and the autonomy to go and to, I think for many of us, at least I'm speaking for myself, to address a lot of the systemic issues that we now see happening in culture today, which Daniel eloquently about in terms of its impact on a massive scale in terms of the ecological crisis. And that awakening, that understanding, that expansion is really important in terms of switching that perspective from negative to, oh, I can actually do something about this in myself, in my community, within my friend group, within my family. And I think that's where it really starts in terms of doing this work of recreating the social fabric. Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know for sure if we're actually born fearful. I think love is what we're born with, but fear is what we learn in the world, right? So I think what each and every one of us have in front of us is the opportunity to dismantle the thought system based on fear that dominate the world, that dominate our ego's thinking, right? And then in so doing, do we actually already find what is already there, right? I don't have to learn to be a loving person. My soul is already loving, but my ego can be so pervasive that I sometimes find that inaccessible. And then I think what's really powerful is looking at negative situations in my life. There's a difference between a judgment and a description. So I can describe a situation as inaccessible, as unequal, as unfair. And because I have dismantled the thought system based on fear, I know that then I can transform that situation with loving perception. Because the Course in Miracles makes a distinction between denial and transcendence. So we're not here to deny that negativity exists and deny that there are systematic injustices in the United States, but we know that since we're working with otherworldly powers, we can allow ourselves to be instruments of that otherworldly transcendence in the places that keep us stuck today.
You guys are awesome.
I just want to play off that real quick.
Yeah.
Just because you mentioned politics again, it was mentioned earlier. I know it's it's a tough pill to swallow, but I do believe that the state of, let's just say, the United States for simplicity right now, because the entire world has been fucked, is it's information. So like what you were saying about description versus judgment, right? So even at negative thoughts, so to speak, I really believe in the non-duality that you're speaking about, Siedeh, as well. Everything is information. Our thoughts are information. Our negative thoughts are information to our programming, our conditioning, our traumas, right? And so what's happening right now are symbolic representations and information of, as far as I'm concerned, the collective consciousness. Trump is a representation of the shadow within us that we're all ignoring. So I just wanted to tie it up with that.
In terms of reframing a situation, so Shakespeare said there's no such thing as good or bad, only thinking makes it so. Some of my all-time favorite principles. And it's hard to swallow when there is a lot of negativity around. How much for each of you does prayer and a connection to God, or whatever you call God, have to do with you rewiring the way that you perceive? Meaning, how much can one just kind of like will themselves into changing the way they see something so that it is not based in their opinion, which could very likely be false. It's like, when do you hit that limit, when you need help from another source of power that can change your mind for you and enable you to see falsehood for what it is?
Science is a really good framework to understand those models in terms of what could be helpful, but also when we look at the combination of, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but science can't explain everything, obviously. There are elements of spirituality that are very subjective, that help us to find our own answers. So a mix of both objectivity from the scientific method that has helped to build our current modern world, but also then the subjective experience that comes from deep spiritual connection. My personal thing is spending time outside in the woods, hiking, which obviously is basically impossible here. And that's also why I think I'm personally attracted to New York, because as a city, it has that kind of deep hollowness of not having that connection to the, because it is this gigantic, concrete thing. So
I asked this question, which might help elicit answers that I think would be useful, because as someone who used to be dominated by negative thinking, not just negative, but homicidal, suicidal thinking for the vast majority of my early life, I wanted to change, but I couldn't change myself. And so I had to have some sort of spiritual framework, some other source of energy or power that can enable me to change my own mind, if that might illustrate the question better.
Well, now that you frame it that way, I don't think that I'd answer your personal question very well. But the question, as I initially understood it, that I was getting ready to say that I'm gonna subvert that shit again, is and I feel like it's been touched on in so many ways through a lot of our comments already, recognizing recognizing the higher power within us, and that everything is everything. And really dissolving the self, and dissolving the I, and knowing in that the I that is suffering is not what I even actually am, yeah.
There's one psychedelic experience, 5-MeO DMT, one of the forms of dimethyltryptamine that it's kind of like the direct experience of nirvana or the void. It's like a non-dual white light immersion where your subjectivity disappears. So maybe that's some kind of like absolute state that underlies everything, which is what Buddhists talk about and so on. I mean, in Tantric philosophy, they talk about how samsara is nirvana. So what we're experiencing is this like temporary, transitory illusion of this reality is actually the like ever-present non-dual, void nirvana state that it always is. So I don't personally, that's sort of my perspective. So I don't really do things like prayer that much. So I think you can actually just look at everything as part of the sort of sacred ceremony of being alive.
I would concur with that too, because I think what I've seen in my own life, and I'm sure most of us would agree, is that who among us wouldn't say that our greatest kind of full-tilt catastrophes and heartbreaks and moments of just utter despair having contributed us to be more tender, merciful, compassionate, forgiving, and wholehearted human beings. So, and that's actually how I look at the term amazing grace. And for full disclosure, I'm a gay man, so when I hear words like God and Christianity, I'm like, what the fuck? I'm thinking about like what amazing grace is. It really has just transformed my perspective when thinking about just horrible injustice in the personal and national kind of context and what it has contributed to allow me to understand resilience and empathy and compassion and connectivity in a deeper way. And I think, I don't believe I could have acquired that shift in perception without a God or love or a universe source. So I would agree that there is some merit to that. Yeah.
Or if nothing else, at least desperation enough to try it.
Well, it worked, so.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that?
I live a lot of my life in ceremony, whether that's with the plants or whether that's, with my family and my friends, or my friends and our family. But I live a lot of my life that way, my life in ritual. And that kind of framework allows me to be present and check in with where I'm at and where everyone else is at. And as someone who did suffer from depression and suicidal thoughts for a long time, due to Accutane, if anybody remembers that crazy joke. But what I realize in a lot of this work is that when you're consumed in your own fears and your own negative thinking, it's so egoic to go, into those fears and just make it about yourself. So I think community and fostering community, especially in the socio-political climate we're in right now, I think fostering community and seeing that even though we are different, we're not separate. I think that connectedness is really important. So that is where I live my life, in this place of ceremony with one another, to find that sense of community and to find the common thread with everyone else, because then I feel like I'm not alone in any of this. I have to trust that we're all going through these similar things, these similar experiences of the human condition for a reason, and that really does instill a lot of hope in me. Even in the days when I'm like, damn, this sucks, like really going through it. I know there's someone else out there that can touch on that, and in that way I feel like we're going through it together. So not to be in a kumbaya moment, but in a real way, like we're cultivating this, soul consciousness together, and to be reminded of that when we get into those spirals of negative thought patterns. We're living sometimes a lot of our traumas that get triggered by what's going on right now. And seeing the God in everybody, that's where we really have it now.
As we, what are, for each of you, some of the most prevalent blocks to manifesting the life that best serves you and your fellows? Like, what are the things that will get you, whether it be greed or selfishness or anger or fear? What are some of the things that we really need to look out for when it comes to, living in a state of flow, changing the way we think, changing our lives, having a positive impact?
Kick it off again. Because I'm very present to that all the time, actually, these days, so being real. For me, I've done a lot of work, and I found myself at an impasse this year, a lot of self-work, to clarify. And I just had a discussion with my healer today about, and we've had this discussion, that it's about fear of the unknown, fear of success. We talk about fear of failure a lot, but for me, it's really fear of success, fear of stepping into my power, and fear of the unknown. And if one is inclined to believe in, what we carry from our ancestors, even science is now showing that with epigenetics or past lives, parallel lives, however you want to look at it, the trauma that we come born with from before and from this lifetime. A lot of our patterning is deeply, deeply ingrained. A lot of the stuff that I'm dealing with is steeped in there. The suffering is familiar, the discomfort is familiar. And to transcend that and to be powerful means taking responsibility. That can be scary. It can mean stepping into power, which is also scary. The accountability that comes without the unknown. What if I'm given it all and I fuck up, embarrass myself? If I lose it all? What if I don't have support? Yeah, so that's what's keeping me from. That's what's been keeping me from turning the other corner. But I think awareness of that is the process, and sometimes supreme patience, which with what is and has been for me kind of a slow process, and just sitting in the unknown and sitting with it and sitting with it and sitting with it, and knowing that that itself is also part of the process.
You a mind reader. Like, how does she know what's going on? Yeah, I relate. Who's next?
I think two of the biggest hurdles for any one of us to kind of reach our highest level of self-actualization is just comparison and scarcity, right? So comparison, I'm not enough, and then who do I think I am when I think I am enough? But astrology readers know that, well, there's a function that each and every one of us have to fulfill, no more or less special than anybody, so we should directly repudiate comparison as often as we can. And then to the point of conscious capitalism, thinking of scarcity, there is, according to high-minded esoteric principle, enough opportunity, blessing, and forgiveness and compassion and resources for all of us to go around. And if we are actively integrating these principles from abstract intellectual thought and woo-woo, right, to here, then it allows us to live a life where we are once again in this world, but not of this world. And I think astrology and other universal spiritual themes is really beneficial to achieve that.
You guys are knocking it out of the park. Last round here.
Anyone else?
I'm just going to piggyback on what you said. The self-criticism and the judgment of yourself and of other people is really what creates those blocks, which stops the energy from flowing. Yeah, just overall, when the body is disconnected from the mind, when we're not aware of our emotional state and without the tools to, to shift that thinking, and when we're not integrating all the lessons that, that are being taught to us, yeah.
I guess thinking about all the things that are happening in the world, which I've been brooding over lately. It's interesting to come into spaces like this, and I'm a member of assemblage, I come to a lot of talks here and so on, but it feels like there's a nascent community of people who are waking up. Sometimes I feel that some of our way we're integrating some of this new spirituality, like The Secret and so on, is actually problematic in that it makes us feel that we can just kind of wish away reality that's actually happening. I would actually love to see these types of communities recognize the urgency of the time that we're in, because if you read like the IPCC report, the United Nations, we have 10 years to redirect human society really profoundly. Every reputed climate scientist on the planet says that we need to start reducing the amount of CO2 we're emitting by 5 to 10% annually. And while we make a shift to renewable energies and regenerative farming practices and so on. So we're at a huge crux time, and our government is obviously working very much against us. So I get a little bit, just to speak for a moment, a little bit kind of concerned about how in these cultures, which are maybe the more aware, more conscious communities that are going on right now, there's such an excessive self-focus. It's always focused on the self, the healing of the self, even the well-being of the self. I don't know how we shift into something where, from ego to we-go, as the Burning Man slogan once said. How would we actually take these types of gatherings, communities, and if we were to aggregate everybody's genius here, everybody's resources, maybe we could influence this systemic catastrophe that we're in right now. But somehow we're not doing that, and I feel very challenged myself. I feel like, writing, personal expression feels not enough right now. and yet, you know, I'm not really somebody who is a natural, like, political or social organizer. I feel like I'm waiting for somebody else to show me how to do it or show me what needs to be done. So those are some of the ideas that are just, that's my little flow, my little moment of flow state at the end of this nice time.
Just to build off what Daniel was saying, is it's really about building a new cultural story. There's a writer, Charles Eisenstein, who has written extensively about this, about how we're kind of exiting this old story of disconnection and separation and really trying to build a new story of interconnectedness. And so when I think about how this applies, I think a lot about how it applies to business. And think about the idea of a bodhisattva in the Buddhist tradition, about these enlightened beings who then come back to actually do work in the world. And I think that's really important when we're facing all these issues around really the social fabric of our communities disintegrating, is really how can we heal ourselves first as individuals, so that we have the autonomy and the agency to contribute in a tremendous way to take on this, you know, challenge that we all are going to face in the next 20 to 30 to 40 years. And by looking at particularly flow states and aligning purpose and meaning with contribution, I think we can start to build that new cultural story. It's just going to require a lot of work. But I think that's something to really look forward to, and something that I'm personally really excited about.